Sergeant Daniel Dan Carter wiped the sweat off his forehead as he scanned the endless desert stretching before him. The twin suns of Mars Delta V blazed high in the sky, turning the sand into a furnace. His combat boots sank into the soft, burning surface with every step, and his helmet HUD displayed warnings about rising temperatures. "This planet is a damned oven," he muttered, adjusting his rifle strap. Dan was on a routine patrol, checking the wreckage of old battles. The war between humanity and the Xilari Empire had left scars all over this world, burnt-out ships, abandoned weapons, and the remains of those who had fallen. The fighting had stopped months ago, but both sides still sent out scouts. Dan wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to finish his job and get back to base. But today, trouble found him. As he walked past a dune, his helmet sensors picked up movement ahead. A faint heat signature. Weak. Unstable. Alive. Dan raised his rifle, scanning the area. His eyes narrowed when he spotted something half buried in the sand. At first, he thought it was a dead body, another casualty of war. But then, it moved. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but his training told him to investigate. An injured survivor could be dangerous or valuable. Keeping his rifle ready, he stepped closer. What he saw made him freeze. Lying in the sand, barely conscious, was a Xilari female. She had deep violet skin with glowing blue markings running across her arms and neck. Her hair, a soft silver color, was tangled with dust and sweat. Her long, whip-like tail twitched weakly, half buried in the sand. She wore a torn Xilari combat suit, but it was damaged and stained with blood. She was dying. Dan took a slow breath, his mind racing. The Xilari were humanity's enemies. Many soldiers would leave her here to die. Some would even finish the job. But Dan wasn't like that. He had seen too much of this war, too many bodies on both sides. Enemy or not, he couldn't walk away. "Hey," he said, lowering his rifle slightly. "You still alive?" The alien woman didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her lips cracked from dehydration. Her fingers weakly gripped the sand, as if trying to crawl forward. Dan sighed and crouched beside her. "You're in bad shape," he muttered, reaching for his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and poured a few drops of water onto her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, bright silver, glowing faintly. She blinked, looking up at him in confusion. For a second, neither of them moved, a human and a Xilari, staring at each other in the middle of a dead world. Then, without warning, she lunged weakly at him. Dan reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist before she could do anything. But there was no real strength in her attack. She was too weak, too exhausted. Her arm trembled in his grip before falling limp. She wasn't fighting. She was desperate. "Water," she whispered, her voice dry and broken. Dan hesitated for only a moment before pressing the canteen to her lips. She gulped down the water greedily, coughing as she swallowed. After a few sips, she gasped and turned her head away, as if embarrassed by her own weakness. Dan sat back, watching her carefully. "You understand me?" he asked. The alien woman didn't answer. Instead, she stared at him, her silver eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Fear, suspicion, gratitude, maybe all of them. Dan sighed. Great, this just got complicated. He could leave her here. It would be the easiest choice. His mission didn't involve rescuing enemy soldiers. But as he looked at her, weak, alone, and barely holding on, he knew he wouldn't. "All right," he muttered, standing up. "Come on, alien. Let's get you out of here." She didn't resist when he gently lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body trembling from weakness. As he carried her, her tail curled slightly around his wrist, as if unconsciously holding on. Dan ignored it and started walking toward his outpost. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. But one thing was certain. His quiet patrol was over. The journey back to the outpost was slow and exhausting. Sergeant Daniel Dan Carter carried the alien woman through the endless desert, his boots sinking into the scorching sand with every step. The twin suns of Mars Delta 5 blazed overhead, and sweat rolled down his face as he adjusted his grip on her. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp with exhaustion. He could feel her shallow breathing against his chest. She wasn't unconscious, but she was barely hanging on. Dan sighed. "I must be crazy," he muttered to himself. The Exilari Empire had been humanity's enemy for years. He had fought their soldiers, seen the destruction their warships had left behind. He should have left her to die in the desert. But when he had seen her, weak, broken, and alone, he couldn't do it. After nearly an hour of walking, he finally reached his makeshift outpost, a small bunker built into the side of a rocky hill. It wasn't much, but it had water, supplies, and shelter from the heat. The alien stirred as he stepped inside, her silver eyes flickering open. She blinked slowly, confusion written all over her face. "You're safe," Dan said, setting her down on a makeshift bed, just an old cot with a thin blanket. "Well, as safe as it gets out here." She didn't respond. She just stared at him, her glowing blue markings dim and dull from dehydration. Dan grabbed his canteen and held it out. "Drink." The alien hesitated, eyeing him warily. Her fingers twitched, but she made no move to take the water. Dan sighed and crouched beside her. "Look, I wouldn't have carried you all the way here just to hurt you," he said. "If I wanted you dead, I would have left you out there." Her silver eyes searched his face, as if trying to figure out if he was lying. After a long pause, she slowly reached out and took the canteen. She drank carefully this time, small sips instead of desperate gulps. When she was done, she set the canteen aside and looked at him again. Dan leaned back against the wall. "So, you got a name?" She hesitated, then spoke in a soft, rough voice. "Vayani." Dan nodded. "Vayani, huh? All right, I'm Dan." She didn't say anything, but her gaze stayed locked on him. Dan exhaled and stood up. "You need rest. We'll talk later." He turned away, grabbing his rifle and checking the small radar display on his wrist. No signs of movement outside. That was good. He didn't need any surprises. Behind him, he heard a soft rustling. When he turned back, he saw that Vayani had curled up on the cot, her tail loosely wrapped around herself. She was still watching him, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Dan sighed. "Get some sleep, alien." She didn't reply. But a few minutes later, her breathing slowed, and she drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. Hours later, Dan sat by the small communication console, trying to decide what to do. He knew protocol. If a soldier found an enemy survivor, they were supposed to report it immediately. But something inside him resisted the idea. Vayani was not a threat. At least, not right now. She was injured, alone, and hunted by her own people. If he called this in, the higher-ups would probably take her away, and he had a bad feeling about what would happen to her. He rubbed his face. "Damn it," he muttered. A soft sound made him turn. Vayani was awake, watching him from the cot. She didn't say anything, just stared. Dan raised an eyebrow. "You always this quiet?" She tilted her head slightly, then spoke, her voice still weak. "You, human soldier?" "Yeah, and you're an alien. Guess that makes us even." She frowned, as if trying to process his words. Her silver eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then she said something that caught him off guard. "You, not like other humans." Dan narrowed his eyes. "You've met a lot of humans." She hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Yes, soldiers. They kill, no mercy." Dan exhaled. "War makes people do bad things." Vayani lowered her gaze. "War makes monsters." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then, suddenly, She shifted forward, wincing as she moved. Dan instinctively reached out, but she flinched, her tail coiling around her waist like a shield. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Just stay still. You're not healed yet." Vayani looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, her tail uncoiled slightly. Dan took that as a small victory. "You hungry?" he asked, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a protein ration, standard issue, not very tasty but enough to survive. Vayani sniffed the food cautiously. Then, to his surprise, she took it. She hesitated, then took a small bite. Her face crunched up in disgust. Dan chuckled. "Yeah, not great, huh?" She frowned, chewing slowly. "Better than starving." Dan smirked. "That's the spirit." For the first time, he saw a tiny flicker of something in her expression. Not quite a smile, but not pure fear either. She was still cautious, still watching him carefully. But the walls between them had started to crack, and Dan had a feeling that, whether he liked it or not, he had just taken on a responsibility bigger than he ever expected. Dan sat by the entrance of the bunker, rifle resting across his lap, eyes scanning the desert horizon. The heat outside had settled, and the twin suns were now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dunes. The desert world of Mars Delta 5 looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Something felt wrong. Behind him, Vayani was sitting on the cot, her silver eyes studying him. She had eaten, drank water, and even rested for a while, but she was still weak. Her body was healing, but her mind was restless. He could see it in her tense posture, the way her tail occasionally flicked like a warning signal. Dan exhaled. "All right, you've been staring at me for the past hour. What's on your mind, alien?" Vayani hesitated, her glowing blue markings dimming slightly. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will come for me." Dan's grip on his rifle tightened. He had been expecting this. "Who?" Vayani's gaze didn't waver. "The Xilari Empire. My own people." Dan frowned. "They left you for dead in the desert. Why would they come back?" Vayani clenched her fists. "Because I am a traitor." Dan raised an eyebrow. "A traitor? You don't look like one." Vayani shook her head. "I was a royal guard. I protected one of our high commanders." Her voice grew heavy with emotion. He wanted peace with humanity. He believed this war was wrong." Dan's jaw tightened. A Xilari leader wanting peace. That was something he had never heard before. "What happened?" he asked. Vayani swallowed hard. "The Empire called him a disgrace, a traitor. They ordered his execution." Her fingers dug into the fabric of the cot. "I tried to protect him, but I failed." Dan sat in silence, processing her words. "So they turned on you too," he said. Vayani nodded. "I escaped, but they hunted me. My own people." She took a shaky breath. "They would rather kill me than let me live with this shame." Dan exhaled sharply. Dan. He had seen war do terrible things to people, but betrayal from your own kind, that was a different kind of pain. Then, suddenly, BEEP. Dan's wrist communicator flashed red. His radar screen showed something moving on the outer edges, unidentified signals. His heart pounded. Vayani's ears twitched. "They found us." Dan immediately shut off the console, lowering his visor and gripping his rifle. His instincts screamed at him to move. "Stay low," he whispered, pressing himself against the wall. "We don't know if it's them yet." Vayani's breathing was quick, but she nodded, sinking back into the cot. Her tail curled tightly around her, a sign of fear. Dan peeked outside. At first, the desert seemed empty. But then, movement. A Xilari scouting drone hovered above the dunes, its metallic body reflecting the orange glow of the setting suns. It scanned the ground, its sensors flickering as it searched. Dan's blood ran cold. That wasn't a random patrol. They were tracking something. They were tracking her. Dan pulled back inside, cursing under his breath. "We've got trouble." Vayani's expression darkened. "It's them." Dan checked his rifle. He had a few grenades, a combat knife, and enough ammo for a fight. But against an entire auxiliary squad, that wasn't a fight. It was a death sentence. "Can you fight?" he asked. Vayani hesitated. She flexed her fingers, but they were still weak. She could barely stand, let alone hold a weapon. She hated the answer she had to give. "Not well." Dan exhaled. Then it was up to him. His mind raced. He could try to run, but there was no cover in the open desert. He could fight, but he was outnumbered. That left one option: a trap. Dan quickly grabbed his backpack, pulling out a remote detonator. The bunker had old explosives buried nearby, leftovers from past battles. If he could lure the auxiliary close enough. "Stay here," he told Vayani. "Don't move unless I tell you." Her eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Dan gave her a smirk. "Ending this before it starts." Before she could protest, he slipped outside, moving low and fast along the rocks. The drone was still scanning, circling like a vulture. Dan found the detonator panel, his fingers flying across the buttons. Then a shadow moved behind him. Dan spun around, rifle raised. Too late. An auxiliary soldier stood there, weapon aimed at his head. Dan cursed. He hadn't even heard them approach. They were fast. The alien soldier's helmet visor glowed green as he spoke in a rough voice. "Human, step away." Dan slowly raised his hands. His finger hovered over the detonator switch in his palm. One move. That's all he needed. The auxiliary narrowed his eyes. "Where is she?" Dan smirked. "Who?" The alien's visor flickered, scanning him. "Do not lie. We know she is here." Dan took a slow breath. He had seconds to act. Then, BM. A loud crash echoed behind them. The auxiliary soldier flinched, just for a second. It was all Dan needed. He slammed his thumb down on the detonator. Boom. A massive explosion erupted, sending sand and smoke flying into the air. Dan dove to the ground, rolling behind a rock as fire engulfed the area. The auxiliary soldier screamed, his armor scorched from the blast. Dan didn't wait. He grabbed his rifle and fired. One shot, clean and fast. The soldier dropped. Dan scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. The explosion had disabled the drone and taken out most of the enemy squad. But he knew more would come. He ran back to the bunker. "Vayani, we need to go. Now." She was already waiting, her silver eyes burning with urgency. She had seen what he did. For the first time, she didn't just see him as a soldier. She saw him as her only chance at survival. And she would never leave his side again. The ground was still shaking from the explosion as Dan grabbed Vayani's arm and pulled her towards the bunker exit. Smoke and dust filled the air, making it hard to see. "Come on, we have to move," Dan shouted. Vayani stumbled but forced herself to keep up. Her body was still weak, but she knew stopping meant death. The explosion had taken out the drone and a few auxiliary soldiers, but there would be more coming soon. Dan grabbed his backpack, stuffing in extra ammo, water, and rations. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and turned to Vayani. "Can you run?" She took a shaky breath. "I will try." Dan nodded. "Good enough. Let's go." They ran out of the bunker and into the desert. The orange sky was growing darker as the twin suns sank below the horizon. Night was coming, but that wouldn't stop their enemies. Vayani's sharp ears twitched. She suddenly grabbed Dan's arm, pulling him down behind a rocky ledge. "What?" Dan started, but she pressed a finger to her lips. Then he heard it. A low humming sound. He peeked over the rocks and saw two auxiliary dropships in the distance. Their red searchlights swept across the sand, looking for survivors. Dan cursed under his breath. They'd brought reinforcements. Vayani's tail flicked in agitation. They won't stop. They will keep hunting. Dan exhaled. He had expected this, but the speed of their response worried him. They wanted Vayani badly. Then we don't give them the chance, Dan said. Vayani's silver eyes met his. You should leave me behind. Dan scowled. Not happening. She clenched her fists. I am a burden. Dan shook his head. No, you're a survivor, just like me. Now let's go. Vayani stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. They moved carefully through the rocks, staying low and quiet. Dan led the way, using his military training to avoid open spaces. The dropships roared overhead, but they didn't spot them. For now. 2 hours later. The desert was cold at night, the heat of the day replaced by a chilling wind. Dan and Vayani had been moving nonstop, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the bunker. Dan checked his wrist scanner. No enemy signals nearby. That was good news. He found a small cave in the side of a rock formation. It wasn't much, but it would give them shelter for the night. We'll rest here, he said. Vayani sat down, exhausted. She hugged her knees to her chest, her glowing markings faint. She was still weak. Dan handed her a water canteen. Drink. She took it and sipped carefully. Humans, always so commanding. Dan smirked. Soldiers have it. Vayani's expression softened slightly. You risked your life for me. Again. Dan shrugged. I'd done worse things in this war. Saving someone for once. Feels like a nice change. Vayani looked down. I do not deserve it. Dan frowned. Why would you say that? She hesitated, then whispered, because I failed my commander. I was supposed to protect him, but I let him die. Dan watched her for a moment. Then he said, I've lost people too. Vayani looked up. Dan's voice was quiet. War takes everything from us. People we love, people we trust. We do what we can, but sometimes it's not enough. She swallowed hard. Does it ever stop hurting? Dan sighed. No, but you learn to live with it. Silence filled the cave. Outside, the desert wind howled softly. Then, for the first time, Vayani relaxed slightly. She didn't say anything, but the way she looked at Dan was different now, not just as a human soldier, but as someone who understood her pain. Dan leaned back against the rock. Get some sleep. We move at sunrise. Vayani nodded, and for the first time since she had been left for dead, she felt safe. Meanwhile, a auxiliary commander stood on the bridge of the dropship, staring at the holographic map of the desert. The explosion destroyed our scout team, one of his officers reported. We found no bodies. The commander's golden eyes narrowed. Then they survived. The officer hesitated. Should we continue the search? The commander's voice was cold. Yes, send out all available forces. I want them found before sunrise. The officer nodded and relayed the orders. As the searchlights spread out across the sand, the hunt began once more. And this time, there would be no escape. The cold desert wind howled through the rocky canyon as Dan sat by the cave entrance, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. The sky above was filled with 1,000,000 stars, but his focus was on the distant red searchlights moving across the dunes. The auxiliary soldiers were still looking for them. Inside the cave, Vayani slept. Her breathing was slow, but her body still looked tense, as if even in sleep she expected danger. Dan sighed and rubbed his tired eyes. He had barely rested since their escape, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The auxiliary had resources, technology, and numbers. All he had was a rifle, some explosives, and a wounded alien woman. Not exactly great odds, but Dan had fought worse battles, and he wasn't about to lose this one. A sudden noise. Just as Dan was about to check his wrist scanner, his soldier instincts flared up. A sound. Soft. Careful. But there. Dan's muscles tensed. He slowly turned his head, scanning the darkness outside. The red searchlights were still far away, but something was nearby. Something watching them. Dan's grip tightened on his rifle. He reached down and grabbed a small rock, then tossed it toward a cluster of boulders a few meters away. For a moment, silence. Then, a shadow moved. Dan reacted instantly. He spun, rifle raised. Wait. A voice. Not Scifi. Not human. Dan hesitated, finger on the trigger. The figure stepped forward. It was small, hunched, and covered in a ragged cloak. Two glowing yellow eyes peered out from under the hood. Dan narrowed his eyes. Not Scifi. Not military. A desert scavenger. Human. The creature rasped, raising its hands. No shoot. Dan didn't lower his rifle. Who are you? The scavenger blinked. Name is Rixo. I live here. You hiding, yes. Dan studied him. Rixo was short, barely reaching his chest, with a long tail and clawed hands. His voice was rough, but not threatening. Dan didn't trust easily, but right now, any information was useful. You see the Scifi searching? He asked. Rixo nodded quickly. Yes. Big trouble. They hunt for you. Dan's jaw tightened. How many? Rixo scratched his chin. 2 dropships, maybe 3. Soldiers. Many. They spread out. Search whole desert. They find you soon. Dan cursed under his breath. He had hoped for more time. But the Scifi were moving fast. Behind him, Vayani stirred. She sat up, blinking sleepily. Dan. Rixo's eyes widened when he saw her. Ah. You. The traitor. Dan moved fast, stepping between them. Easy, he warned. We're not enemies. Rixo took a step back, tail flicking nervously. She important. Scifi want her dead. Vayani's expression darkened, but she said nothing. Dan lowered his rifle slightly. Look, Rixo, you know this desert better than us. We need to get out of here before the Scifi find us. Rixo rubbed his hands together, thinking. Maybe I help. Dan's eyes narrowed. What do you want? Rixo grinned, revealing sharp little teeth. Trade. You got food. Dan reached into his backpack and pulled out a small ration bar. He tossed it to Rixo, who snatched it greedily and sniffed it. Then he took a bite. His eyes widened. None. Human food good. Dan crossed his arms. You help us or not? Rixo licked his fingers. Then he nodded. Yes. I know secret tunnels, old paths under the sand. Scifi do not know. I take you. Vayani's ears perked up. Underground tunnels. Rixo grinned. Yes. Safe. But we must go now. Dan glanced at Vayani. She nodded. All right, Dan said. Lead the way. Into the tunnels. Rixo led them down the canyon, moving fast despite his small size. The night was dangerously silent, and every step felt like a risk. Finally, they reached a hidden entrance between 2 rocks. Rixo pulled back a large metal hatch, revealing a dark tunnel leading underground. Dan hesitated. The Scifi patrols were out there, but the tunnels could be just as dangerous. Still, they had no choice. One by one, they climbed inside. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and metal, and the walls were covered in old markings. Vayani ran her fingers over them. These symbols, they are ancient. Rixo chuckled. Yes, old civilization. Before humans, before Scifi. They built these tunnels. Now, forgotten. Dan adjusted his rifle strap. As long as they keep us hidden, I don't care. Rixo nodded. Follow close. Do not get lost. They moved deeper into the tunnels, the darkness swallowing them whole. The Scifi close in. Back on the surface, the Scifi commander stood outside the now empty cave. His golden eyes burned with frustration as he studied the tracks leading away. They had help, he muttered. His officer stepped forward. Orders, sir. The commander narrowed his eyes. Scan for underground tunnels. If they're hiding beneath the sand, we'll bury them alive. The officer saluted and relayed the order. As the auxiliary technology activated, the sand trembled. The hunt wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The underground tunnel stretched in every direction like a maze. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the dim glow of Vayani's markings and the small flashlight on Dan's rifle. Rixo scurried ahead, his small form moving swiftly through the darkness. Keep close, he whispered. Tunnels twist and turn. Easy to get lost. Dan glanced back at Vayani. She looked tired but determined, her silver eyes scanning the ancient walls as if trying to read their history. This place feels old, she murmured. Rixo nodded. Very old. Before humans, before auxiliary, before war. The ones who built this, all gone. Dan wasn't interested in history. His focus was on survival. How far do these tunnels go? Rixo scratched his chin. Many miles. Some lead to mountains. Some to nowhere. Dan frowned. Let's hope you know the right path. Rixo grinned, showing his sharp little teeth. I always know the way. Above the surface, the auxiliary commander stood near the entrance to the tunnels, his golden eyes narrowing as he studied the ground. Sir, an officer reported, our scanners confirm movement underground. They are using old passageways. The commander smirked. Then we bring the tunnels down on their heads. He turned to his soldiers. Prepare the seismic charges. If they want to hide beneath the sand, they will die beneath it. The auxiliary war machines moved into position, drilling into the rocky surface, preparing to collapse the tunnels below. A dead end. Dan, Vayani, and Rixo moved deeper, their footsteps echoing. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls becoming smoother, as if shaped by machines instead of hands. Then, they hit a dead end. A massive metal door stood before them, covered in strange symbols. It looked ancient, untouched for centuries. Rixo's ears twitched. This is not right. Dan cursed. You said you knew the way. Rixo rubbed his head. I do. But this door, this was not here before. Vayani stepped closer, running her fingers over the markings. They glowed faintly at her touch. This is not auxiliary technology, she whispered. It is something else. Something powerful. Dan turned. We don't have time for mysteries. We need another path. Rixo's eyes darted around. Maybe there is another way. Then the ground shook. A deep rumbling echoed through the tunnel. Dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling. Dan's blood went cold. They're trying to bury us alive. Vayani's eyes widened. We must move. The rumbling grew louder. Cracks spread across the tunnel walls. The auxiliary were using seismic charges, collapsing the tunnel section by section. Dan grabbed Rixo. Find another way. Now. Rixo squeaked in panic, scrambling to the wall, running his claws along the stone. There. Small passage. Not big, but maybe we fit. Dan turned to Vayani. Go. Vayani slipped through the narrow gap, barely fitting through. Dan followed next, forcing himself into the tight space. Rixo crawled behind them. Just as they got through, the ceiling of the main tunnel collapsed behind them. A cloud of dust and debris rushed forward, forcing them to cover their mouths. They had escaped death by seconds. The hidden chamber. Dan coughed, shaking the dust from its hair. Everyone okay? Vayani nodded, though she looked shaken. Rixo patted his fur, muttering, Too close, too close. Dan looked around. They were in a different chamber, much larger than the previous tunnels. The walls were lined with ancient machines, still glowing faintly with energy. Vayani's breath hitched. This is a ship. Dan frowned. A ship. She pointed at the massive structure built into the stone. Yes, a starship buried long ago. Older than Xilari. Older than us all. Rixo's eyes gleamed with excitement. Ooh, treasure. Dan ignored him, his instincts on high alert. If this was a ship, could it still be operational? The ground rumbled again. The Xilari weren't stopping. We need to move, Dan said. If this thing has power, maybe it has an exit. Vayani nodded. Let me try. She placed her hand against the ship's console. The markings glowed brighter, responding to her touch. The air around them hummed with energy. Dan raised an eyebrow. That's not normal. Vayani's expression was unreadable. I think it recognizes me. Rixo's tail flicked excitedly. Then make it work, before we all get crushed. Vayani closed her eyes, focusing. The glow intensified. Then, with a deep rumbling sound, the ship came to life. Panels lit up. Ancient engines groaned. The floor trembled. A hidden door slid open, revealing a tunnel leading upward. Dan grinned. That's our way out. Vayani stumbled slightly, the effort exhausting her. Dan caught her before she could fall. Easy, he said. You did good. She looked up at him, her silver eyes filled with exhaustion, and something else. Dan cleared his throat, turning back to Rixo. All right, Herbal. Let's move. Rixo muttered something about humans always giving orders, but he ran ahead anyway. As they moved up the tunnel, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. This ship, it wasn't just ancient. It was waiting for something. And somehow, Vayani was the key. Above ground, the Xilari commander stood at the edge of the collapsed tunnel. His soldiers scanned for life signs. One officer saluted. They were inside. Sir, no movement detected. They are buried. The commander narrowed his eyes. He didn't believe it. The hunt wasn't over. Double the patrols, he ordered. If they are still alive, I want them found. As the Xilari continued their search, deep below the desert, something ancient had awakened. And the war was about to change forever. The hidden tunnel sloped upward, leading them toward the surface. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of ancient technology vibrated through the walls. Dan moved ahead, rifle ready, his heart pounding. They were close. Too close. Behind him, Vayani stumbled, her strength fading. Dan caught her arm, steadying her. Stay with me, he said. She nodded weakly. The ship, it's waking up. Dan didn't understand all of it, but one thing was clear. This ancient vessel was tied to Vayani. Rixo scurried ahead, his glowing yellow eyes wide with excitement. Ooh, I see light. Exit ahead. Dan's grip on his rifle tightened. If Rixo could see the exit, so could the Xilari. The Xilari ambush. As soon as they stepped into the open air, blaster fire rained down on them. Dan reacted instantly, tackling Vayani to the ground as the rocky canyon walls exploded from the impact. Run, he shouted. Rixo yelped and dived behind a boulder, while Dan rolled into cover, raising his rifle. The Xilari had been waiting for them. A squad of heavily armored soldiers surrounded the canyon, weapons aimed. Above, two Xilari dropships hovered, their searchlights piercing the darkness. A deep, commanding voice echoed through the canyon. Surrender. Now. Dan turned, eyes locking onto the Xilari commander, standing tall in dark red armor. His golden eyes glowed under his helmet. Dan cursed. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. Vayani struggled to sit up. She whispered, Dan, I can feel it. The ship, it's speaking to me. Dan frowned. What does that mean? She placed a hand on the ground. The sand beneath them began to vibrate. Dan's eyes widened. Oh, that's what you mean. The earth trembles. The Xilari soldiers hesitated as the ground shook violently. The canyon walls cracked, and dust filled the air. Then, a massive metal structure rose from beneath the sand. The ancient ship was awakening. Rixo's jaw dropped. Ooh, big treasure. The auxiliary commander took a step back, his eyes narrowing. Impossible. Dan didn't waste time. He grabbed Vayani's arm. Can you control it? She closed her eyes, feeling the connection, her markings glowing brighter. The ship responded, its engines humming with power. I think I can fly it. Dan smirked. Then let's go. The final battle. The auxiliary opened fire, trying to stop them. Blaster shots exploded around them as Dan covered Vayani, returning fire with deadly precision. Rixo screeched and ducked behind a rock. Humans crazy. I want no part of this. Dan grabbed him by the collar. Too late, buddy. They ran toward the ship as a massive ramp extended from its side. The entrance hissed open, revealing a dark interior filled with flickering lights. Inside. Now, Dan shouted. Vayani and Rixo sprinted up the ramp, while Dan turned to provide cover. He fired a well-placed shot, hitting an auxiliary soldier square in the chest, sending him tumbling back. The auxiliary commander growled in frustration. Stop them. The dropships above fired rockets, aiming for the ancient ship. But the moment the first missile struck, the ship's energy shields activated. A blue force field rippled across the surface, absorbing the blast. Dan grinned. They had a chance. He ran inside just as the ramp began closing. The ship takes flight. Inside, Vayani sat at a glowing console, hands trembling. The ship's controls responded to her touch, ancient symbols flickering to life. Dan, she whispered, this ship, it's not just a machine. Dan grabbed the back of her chair. I don't care if it's a magic space god. Can it fly? The ship rumbled, engines roaring to life. The walls vibrated as power surged through its core. Then, they lifted off the ground. Outside, the auxiliary panicked. The commander stepped back, watching as the massive vessel rose into the sky, sand and debris swirling in its wake. His officers shouted, they're escaping. The commander clenched his fists. Not if I can help it. He turned to the dropships. Shoot them down. Breaking through. Missiles launched, streaking toward the rising ship. Inside, alarms blared. Dan cursed. Vayani. I see it, she shouted. Her fingers danced over the controls. The ship reacted instantly. A barrier of blue energy flared around them, deflecting the missiles. The ship's systems locked onto the auxiliary dropships and fired back. Beams of pure energy shot from the ship's hull, tearing through the enemy vessels. One dropship exploded midair, while the other veered off, badly damaged. Dan let out a breath. That's what I'm talking about. Vayani was breathing heavily. The ship is powerful, but I don't know how long I can hold it. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. Just get us out of here. She nodded, focusing all her energy. The ship tilted upward, engines flaring. Then, with a final burst of speed, they broke through the planet's atmosphere, leaving the auxiliary behind. A new beginning. As they entered space, the view stretched before them, a sea of stars, endless and full of possibilities. Dan exhaled, stepping back. We did it. Rixo, still holding onto the wall, groaned. I think I'd leave my stomach behind. Vayani slumped in her seat, exhausted but smiling softly. Dan sat beside her. So, what now? She looked at him, silver eyes gleaming. This ship was waiting for someone to wake it up. Now that it's flying again, I think it has a destination. Dan raised an eyebrow. And you know where? Vayani nodded. I can feel it. Dan grinned. Then let's go see what's out there. He turned to Rixo. You in? Rixo sighed. I like treasure, but humans, too much trouble. Dan chuckled. Yeah, well, welcome to the team. With a final push of energy, the ship's engines roared, blasting forward, disappearing into the stars. Their adventure had only just begun.